Hey guys, Redneck Mini 14 here, and today I'm going to talk about why the Ruger Mini 14 does not take AR-15 magazines. Now I see this kind of complaint all the time, whether it's on YouTube, on Facebook, on internet forums, wherever. I see people complaining about this all the time. They say, well, why can't the Ruger Mini 14 use AR-15 magazines? If the Mini 14 could take AR mags, then I would get a Mini 14, hands down, or, whatever. People always complain about the fact that the Mini 14 magazines, they're harder to find, they're more expensive. There's, the rock back system that's not as easy as the, just the push-in system that the AR has. Why can't Ruger make the Mini 14 with AR-15 magazines? Well, the answer is pretty simple actually, and it's the fact that the Mini 14 has been around since the 70s. And I know that the AR-15, the M16 style rifle has been around since the 60s, but you got to understand, both of these rifles were going to be submitted to the military for testing for the new, the main rifle for the military. So when Ruger was designing the Mini 14, they were trying to base it off of the M14, which was the current military rifle of the time, and it had a rock back system just like this. And of course it had 20 round magazines. I don't know if the 30 rounders were put into the design in the early days of the Mini 14 or not, but I think what they were going for were these 20 round magazines, similar to the M14 with the 308 magazines. They were basically wanting to build a very similar rifle to what the military already had, so that training and all that would be very similar to the M14, which makes sense because then you're saving money, and you basically have the same rifle, at least exteriorly, with a very similar way of putting in the magazine. Now, what Colt and Armalite did, they went a totally different route and decided to build an entirely new rifle from the ground up. It started out as the AR-10, and then it went to the AR-15, which became the M16, select fire version. So they had an entirely different design, which consisted of a push-in magazine system with a mag well and push button mag release and all that. And they brought their product to the table first, and so that's what the military went with. And and the Mini 14 came out a few years later, I think in 1973. The AR-15 came out in like the late 60s. So yeah, of course the AR-15 had been around for a little while by the time the Mini 14 came into effect. But you got to remember, back in the 60s and 70s, the AR-15, at least on the civilian market, wasn't that popular of a rifle. It was mainly a rifle that either the military had, or people who just liked military guns bought. But as far as on the civilian market, the AR-15 was not that popular, at least not by today's standards, because they didn't have dozens upon dozens of companies making rifles and parts and lowers and uppers and all this. It was basically just Colt and Armalite, I think. I don't know. Maybe there were other companies making them back then, but as far as popularity went, the AR-15 wasn't as popular as it was today. And so there was no need for Ruger to change over their magazine system to an AR-15 system, because the need wasn't there. And the Mini 14 was basically a hunting rifle for the most part, because Other than that, it was a police rifle that police agencies used, and the 20 round and 30 round magazines weren't readily available to the public. So there really was no need to make the Mini 14 take AR-15 magazines. And of course, time goes on, and you get into the 80s and the 90s, and then all the way up to the 2000s, where the AR-15 is a more popular rifle, and all of a sudden everybody just forgot the history behind the Mini 14 and the AR-15, and they're like, well, there's so many options for the AR-15, why can't the Mini 14 take the same magazines? Well, because it would take a lot of time and money and effort to change the entire magwell system of the Mini 14. It's just not worth it, considering you would still have to produce the old magazines for the older rifles. It's just not worth it, at least not to Ruger, because I mean, you have thousands and probably millions of these magazines out there, and you have a couple million of these Mini 14s out there that use this system for the magazine. It's just not worth it to change over, take all that time and money to change over to a system like this. And of course, to do an AR-15 system for the magazine, you would have to have this magwell sticking out of the bottom of the rifle, which just wouldn't look right on a Mini 14. It just wouldn't. So, that's the answer to why Ruger refuses to put the AR-15 magazine in the Mini 14. Well, it's not that they refuse to do it, it's that it's not worth it. So, if you don't want to have to buy the expensive Mini 14 magazines, get an AR-15 or get something that uses AR-15 magazines. In other words, just stop complaining that Ruger uses their own proprietary magazines, because that's the thing. Back in the 60s and 70s, everybody used their own proprietary magazines. This was a proprietary magazine for the AR-15. The AR-15 was the only gun that used this magazine. Now, of course, as time went on, other guns like Kel-Tec and the Tavor and things like that would take AR-15 magazines as well, because the AR-15 became more popular. But the Mini 14 predates all those rifles. And so the Mini 14 has its own proprietary magazine, but the AR-15 did start out with a proprietary magazine, just like every other gun that came out back then, pretty much at least, had their own proprietary magazines. Now, of course, today you have so many different rifles and pistols that use other magazines, like, you can use Glock magazines in some guns, and Smith & Wesson 59 magazines, and all, But back then, it wasn't common practice to have a gun take another gun's magazines. It just wasn't what was common back then. And, of course, there are some aftermarket magazines, like the Tapcos and the Pro Mags, but they're just, they're a little bit more expensive. They're nowhere near as expensive as the factory Mini 14 magazines, but they're still a little bit more than the AR-15s. But to me, as long as it's a good magazine and it's a good rifle, I have no need to really complain about the Mini 14's system of magazines. I like the Mini 14. I had the Mini 14 before I had an AR-15. And I'll continue to love the Mini 14, and I do love the AR-15, but let's face it, it's not a traditional style of rifle with a traditional wooden stock like this. I like this better than this. I'm not a tactical kind of guy, but I do enjoy shooting tactical rifles. But anyway, that's the answer as to why Ruger doesn't put AR-15 magazines in the Mini 14. I mean, it's really not that complicated of an answer, really, because, basically you just got to look at the history of the two rifles and, the popularity of the two rifles over the years. And, it's just not worth it to change over the Mini 14's mag system this late in the game. So, anyway, subscribe to my channel, like me on Facebook. I'm Redneck Mini 14, and until next time, be safe.